Hemispheric lateralization. Hemisphere, I think hopefully we know, there's a right and left hemisphere of the cerebrum. And lateralization is a fancy way of saying that the sides specialize. So the left side does things that the right side doesn't do, and vice versa. So we'll start with the easy stuff that I was able to cover actually in the lecture a little bit. But just to review, right hand is controlled by the left side of the brain. Left hand is controlled by the right side of the brain. And you see the fibers cross. Actually, there's the fibers for the optic nerve with visual. There's where they cross. So the crossing is called decussation. When it crosses, fibers cross from left to right. And the fibers themselves we call commissural fibers. And there's all different types of commissural fibers, like you can see there. Some of you hopefully already know that's the corpus callosum. We'll take a look. Oops, that's not what I meant. Commissural fibers, or some sort of commissural tract. That's the other thing. Tract is another word it could be, because tract is just a bundle of myelinated axons, or sometimes unmyelinated, sorry. Bundle of axons running together. You could have a tract right here. A bunch of axons running right to left. Okay, so that's part of our lateralization, is which side of the brain controls which side of the body. But you can see there's lots of other specialties in the left versus the right. So left, I think I was only able to ask one class this. What do you think of? Most people think of analytical. Yeah, that's fine. Analytical, detailed-oriented. You're good at sorting things, you know. So usually people associate science and math with the left hemisphere. And it is very meticulous. And categorical would be like, oh, I'm going to create, well, we do this with animals, a taxonomy. You're like, here's the animal kingdom, for instance, and then it's split into reptiles, aves, etc. Actually, going farther than that, cockroaches over here. That says animal. So those are ways of creating categories, and it's very meticulous and detail-oriented. So that's really different from the right side. The right side, most people think of art and creativity, and that's good. But we have to understand what creativity really means. So, for instance, most musicians are good mathematicians. There are some of them are excellent mathematicians, and you think of music as being an art, but if you read sheet music, you'll notice there's a lot of little details about time signature, key signature, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of left brain activity associated with music, and also associated with math. There's a lot of little details. But, of course, music we think of as art and creativity, because music is expressing something. Like you could have, I don't know, a love song, a funeral song, whatever the case may be. So you're using for music both sides of the brain. You want to convey a particular big picture message, but you've got to get the little details of like the key signature down. So you use both sides of your brain. Same with mathematics. So you think of it as detail oriented, and there are a lot of details to those equations, but there are big picture questions about like which equation is appropriate and that kind of thing. So really, for every activity, you do use both sides of the brain to do it. It just you use them in different ways. So language is a classic example of lateralization in that, at least we think, it's only on the left side in most people. In a handful, I think it's 15% of left-handed people, the hemispheres are switched. So still pretty rare because left-handedness isn't that common to begin with. Okay, so the areas on the left hemisphere involved with language. Motor speech area, sometimes also called Broca's. I'm actually fine if you call it either Broca's area or motor speech area. And that's going to be, motor control over whatever form of communication you're doing. It could be talking, that requires muscle control. It could be gestural, if you have a sign language. And then the other area, here it is, Wernicke's area. And it is specifically devoted to comprehension. So what's interesting is Broca and Wernicke were both around in, I think it was the 1800s, and there weren't any brain scans, and it wasn't really known what did what parts functioned in what way inside the brain. And Broca and Wernicke had a patient in both cases who had some sort of deficit, and so after they died, they did a biopsy. They found, this was a damaged area, and they're like, well, that's where it is. That's language comprehension. It's usually not that simple. You're going to use most of your brain. Like, for instance, if you're going to describe that apple, you have to send that information over. So, I'm sorry, describe visually an apple. So, for instance, if you're going to visually describe an apple, or if you see an apple and you need to tell somebody, the idea of what an apple is and what it looks like is going to be over here on the occipital lobe. And so you would talk then, actually not to there. Let me try this again. Okay, so you see an apple, you need to describe it to somebody, you're going to have that connection. If you're going to understand it, somebody's visually describing something. Let me change colors. You're listening. That did not change the colors. You're listening now in red. You're going to have to send it back to the occipital cortex in order to like visualize what you're listening to. So you use all parts of your brain for language in some way or another. But these two areas do seem to be very important to language. So there are a lot of people who this motor speech gets knocked out in a stroke, the neurons starve. And then there's other, traumatic brain injuries, for instance, that could damage these as well. And it's clear that language has been severely affected. Incidentally, if you lose motor speech or Broca's area for some reason, you can't talk. And generally, if you do talk, it might be a word or two, or your speech is going to be very stilted, perhaps, because you're going to be searching for that word. If you have damage to Wernicke's area, it's kind of bizarre. I mentioned this in the lecture, but yeah, you just can speak gibberish in, I guess grammatically can correct sentences in terms of like noun, adjective placement, etc. But they're nonsensical, and the people who have damage to Wernicke's cannot understand what you are doing, or what you're asking, sorry. People with Wernicke's cannot actually understand what you're saying. So if you ask them to do a task, probably going to be incapable of doing it because, yeah, they don't really comprehend what you're asking for. It's very strange. Okay, so the areas are motor speech and Wernicke's. You could also call it Broca's and Wernicke's. What do they do? Language production. So this is production over here. I realize I talked about this on the other slide, didn't I? Okay. So I spoke about this in a previous video, actually, the two language areas. So this is a bit of a review. Okay, so those are the two areas. What do they do? On the other side, again, they're on the left side. That's the hemisphere. What happens on the right side in those general areas? Or just generally, does the right side contribute to language? Well, of course it does. Like, there's language-related art, like poetry. So you use the other side of your brain for language, but in a really big picture sense. So on the left hemisphere, you're going to have all the details of like which words in the grammatical, order or details that are very important to language. But right hemisphere is going to be processing language in terms of big picture, like what is this poem about? This is the actual words of the poem are going to be processed over here. On the right side, you're going to be like, is this a love poem? Is this, I don't know, a hate poem? The point is, you're going to get the big picture. And it's not just like artistic material. Let's say art. So it's not always going to be, say, artistic composition or materials. It could also be something like you're reading a newspaper article. And in order to read the individual words and the grammar, you're going to have left hemisphere. It's pretty busy. But in order to understand what was the big point of that article, what were they writing about? What's my take-home message? That's really a big picture right thing, right hemispheric kind of thing. So I just want to point out that terms that your book uses, categorical hemisphere, think of being nitpicky, detail, categorizing things carefully. Representational, big picture. When you think about it, all art is a representation of something else. If you've got a painting of a landscape, it's not the actual landscape, it's a representation of it. And you could argue this for abstract work as well. The point is, representational does refer to seeing the big picture and perhaps representing it in some way within your brain or in the way that you describe it, something like that. So you do use both areas of the brain for everything.